It's November the 18th, 1994. I'm sitting here in a conference room in Peabody Hall on the campus of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And it's my happy task this afternoon to conduct a conversation with an old friend and colleague, alumni distinguished professor emeritus Norman Johnson. So here we go, and it seems appropriate that I should ask Norman if he would begin by telling us a little bit about his early childhood. Maybe we'll start. Norman, can you tell us something about your parents?
Yes, thank you, Walter. My father was an exports manager in a building merchant supply company. My mother was from a family of Welsh people who had come to London in the 19th century to obtain work, and they met in the course of the early 20th century and settled down in Ilford in Essex, which is the east side of London. I was born there on January the 9th in 1917. I went to school at the County High School in Ilford from 1927 to 34, which was fairly uneventful. I then went on to University College in London from 1934 to 36, when I took a bachelor's degree in mathematics. There was a rule at that time that you had to have 3 years undergraduate work to qualify to receive the degree. And one of my fellow students said he was going to take statistics, so I said I would too. And we both went over and took statistics. I took a bachelor's in statistics in 1937 and a master's in 1938. Professor Egon Pearson, who was head of the department at that time, invited me to be an assistant lecturer, which is like an assistant professor here. And I was in that job just for a year when the war started.
Now, you've skimmed over a great deal of territory rather quickly, Norman. Didn't you display at, say, grammar school, high school, more mathematical talent, say, than the average student, or?
Well, I would hardly say that. It was one of my more favourite subjects, although when I was thinking of what I would be doing if I went to university, I was more tending towards studying Romance languages.
Really?
But what really decided me was that I decided to take Spanish as a second foreign language instead of French, and I have to catch up on my Latin to do that, and it would take perhaps an extra year to do that, so I decided I'd better go in for the scientific side of what used to be called the higher schools examination at that time, and I took mathematics and pure and applied, and physics and chemistry.
So in other words, we might say that if Latin had not been a requirement to do Romance languages at London University,
yes,
we might have
never
lost a statistician. Well, I mean, see, that's an interesting
loss
thing.
For all of us.
And before we leave the subject of your parents, I'd just like you to remind me of something I may have a little wrong, but I remember attending a funeral at Duke Chapel with you once of Hartley.
Yes.
Didn't you tell me that your father had helped in the manufacture of the...
Yes, that's right.
Tell us about that.
My father's company that he worked for supplied the stained glass for the windows in Duke Chapel. That was one of their special special features. It wasn't a main commercial job, but they did do this making stained glass. It was always sort of custom ordered, and they did do this. And when I was visiting Duke, they did remark that this had come from England, the glass for the windows there. Of course, at that time, when he said Duke University, I didn't have any idea what that meant. I thought it was something to do with nobility. But
well, we know that's not true.
No, by no means.
Yes, I remember first learning about Duke in connection with extrasensory perception, but...
Well, yes, I can tell you something about that too.
No, we'll do, by all means.
Only, this again, a sort of indirect thing. I had a friend at school whose father ran a hairdresser's shop close to Liverpool Street Station in London. And among their customers, they had Professor Soule, S.G. Soule, at it was East London College, now it's Queen Mary College, and he was very active in this extrasensory perception. And this was quite early on, about 1937 or 38. He did talk to me about it once when I was up there once with my friend and visiting their shop. So I had heard something about that, and I had heard about Duke University too from that too.
Oh, so...
I hadn't heard much about the University of North Carolina.
No.
We've made up for it since.
Well, now tell me, when you were studying statistics at University College,
yes,
who were the principal teachers at that time?
Well, of course, there was Professor Pearson, Egon Pearson, Jerzy Neyman from Poland. There was Florence David, who was just starting, and Bernard Welsh, who'd come from Oxford a couple of years before. Neyman, at that time, his English accent was very Polish, and tended to distract our students from what he was teaching us. But he was quite stimulating, and in fact, he was my advisor, as they would say, superintendent, it was called there, for my master's thesis, which I presented in 1938. Of course, then he went to Berkeley, and didn't have so much contact with him after that. But the rest of us all went into the Ordnance Board when the war started.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, now, while you were studying statistics, what sort of topics, what course, the courses offered in those days must have covered a different range of topics from what we get today.
There was probability theory, which was sort of more as an academic thing. There was just being developed by Egon Pearson a course on testing hypotheses, which was and significance tests and power functions, which were just coming up at that point. They were in the forefront of the development.
When did they publish their great stuff?
1935 to 1937.
So you were just there at that time.
And Neyman, of course, with confidence intervals. And there was also, on the applied side, we had courses in the economics department, partly on index numbers and things like that. And we also had a course on vital statistics taught at London School of Medicine, London School of Tropical Medicine, and, by Bradford Hill, I think, was there at the time, which was supposed to sort of counteract the more purely academic atmosphere at University College.
Because I suppose at that time there wasn't much attention paid to, say, time series or random processes.
Random processes, no, that was beyond our ken, but time series were there because there was Fourier analysis and periodogram analysis. We knew there were such things, but they didn't do sort of ungentlemanly things like having dependence between successive errors or anything like that. They just were mostly Fourier expansions.
And then suddenly the World War II starts. Where were you the day war declared, for instance?
Well, the day war
was declared.
I just got home for vacation in Minehead in Somerset, which I cut short because the transport was going to be commandeered by the government, and I thought I'd better get home quickly. So I went on a mail delivery train. It seemed to me it took ages to get from Taunton up to London, and I got home the night before, and then the Sunday morning at 11 the war was declared.
So were thoughts about your job rushing through your mind that day?
Well, not a lot, because Professor Pearson had told us that he was making this sort of arrangements, so it had been apparent there was likely to be a war. And we knew that we would go in the first instance to the Ordnance Board, and in the first instance we'd go to Oxford, where we'd got some accommodation in the Society of Home Students near to Christchurch.
I see. So when did you in fact join the Ordnance Board?
About September the 20th.
So pretty soon after the war began.
We stayed there until Christmas, and then we were sort of a detached group just on our own there in Oxford. Then we joined the Ordnance Board proper, which had been moved from the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich out to Footscray near Sidcup.
Yes, because that's
where this was quite near to where you were at that time.
I was at school there,
yes. And I remember in 1940 or so, I took up an allotment, which is sort of growing food for victory, supposed to be. Mostly I seem to grow carrot fly, which I don't think really frightened the Germans very much. But I used to watch the pupils at Sidcup High School playing football.
Well,
and I saw you on some Saturday mornings, I'm sure.
Very likely. Playing soccer, of course, we should say in America.
Oh, yes, soccer. That's right. So that was an early contact, but it was a long while before we met.
Before we met.
I realised afterwards I must have been seeing you then.
Yes.
And then we moved back into London to Kensington in 1942. So the Ordnance Board as a whole moved into what used to be and was later De Vere Hotel in De Vere Gardens in Kensington.
And at that time, the V1 bombs were falling.
Well, they started in 1944. We were still there at that time.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You were still.
While we were at Sidcup, I was in the Home Guard. Perhaps they decided I wasn't really much use for the Home Guard. I became what here would be called a firefighter. And I was still doing that, and we did fire watching like everybody else did in Kensington, and only I had one real operation. There was a neighbouring office building that some incendiary bombs had gone into the top, and it was all burning. So we gallant firefighters rushed there with all our equipment to put it out. But the young ladies who worked in the office there had put it all out before we got there.
Oh.
And they could see we were a bit crestfallen, and they said, "Never mind, Daps, have a cup of tea."
Oh, I see.
Which was quite good considering tea was rationed.
Yes, well, now let me ask you something. When you worked for the Ordnance Board, did you have any kind of equipment to help doing all the tedious arithmetic, or was in those days?
We had a hand Brunsviga.
Oh my goodness!
And we had various assistants who would do it for us. That was the nearest thing to a.
Well, could you trust these assistants?
Well, we always had to do it ourselves, and then they did it as well, and then we saw if it agreed. But there were a lot of these things were used for calculation, and it wasn't till after the war that we got these first electric machines, not the electronic ones like they have nowadays.
Yes. Marchants and Friedens and so on.
Yes.
Well, what sort of calculations were you engaged in there? I mean, range tables?
No, not range tables. It was due to the Carl Pearson, that's Egon Pearson's father, having worked with the Ordnance Board in 1914 to 18, that we got this contact to start with, and they did range tables then. But this time we were in what was called terminal ballistics, which it was to do mostly with what happened when the missiles exploded, rather than how they got there, which is the range tables, and particularly anti-aircraft, but not only.
Did you ever attend any actual practical experiments in terminal ballistics?
Well, there were various things. I mustn't give away official secrets, so I don't think these would be any good for anybody if they heard it now. They used to explode anti-aircraft shells in a sandbag honeycomb, and then count all the holes and see how far they went through.
I see. Was this done, by the way, at Shoebury Ness?
That was done at Shoebury Ness.
How did I guess?
And then there was a place near Boscombe Down, I think, where they used to shoot at targets being towed, and sometimes by pilotless aircraft. They were supposed not to be too accurate then, because these were very expensive, and you weren't supposed to actually shoot them down. And occasionally you'd go out when there was an air raid on, and you'd see the people doing the reading to get to do the gun settings, the fuse and the elevation and the azimuth and so on. Because they were not electronic, they were very complicated things with lots of worm wheels and various sort of gear trains involved, but they didn't do too badly, I suppose.
Yes, I can remember in 1948 being shown an American proximity fuse from an anti-aircraft shell, and it included in it what we called in England a radio valve, what they called tubes.
Yes.
And I can remember being appalled at the waste of money. You know, a whole tube goes down up in smoke every time you fire at it. However, I digress. While the war was on, though, amongst all this, you found time to study actuarial science.
Well, I'd already taken the first part, the more mathematical part, and the compound interest in 1937 or 38, because I didn't know what sort of career I was going to land up in. And then, of course, the Institute of Actuaries discontinued exams during the war, but I continued to study, and I took one or two exams just when the war finished, and then finally, when it looked pretty clear I wasn't going to go into the insurance business, I'd invested so much effort, I thought I might as well finish it off and get the fellowship. And I progressed. I didn't always pass the examinations. I did fail one or two.
You actually failed one? Norman,
yes.
What a confession.
Anyway,
Can I ask what subject proved to be so difficult?
Yes. Reversions and life interests. That was the. I failed that twice. Anyway.
I don't even know what a reversion is. Is it?
Well, if someone's left you an annuity, but you want to get the capital of it, or you've got a reversion to something when someone dies, because you don't want to wait for them to die. You don't kill them off. You sell it to somebody else.
Oh,
who's willing to wait. They wait until they die.
This sounds like an Agatha Christie device, but
yes. Well, I went on and completed the fellowship of the Actuaries in 1948, and I got my PhD in 1949. Which was delayed because of the war.
It must have been difficult to do all this studying in the war, though, wasn't it?
Well, the last 4 years weren't in the war.
Oh, the last 4 years of your actuarial stuff, yeah.
And, well, during the war, there were various times, it wasn't all, as most people in the war, in the services as well, say most war is boring with occasional moments of intense horror.
What many American viewers of this tape will not realize is that so much of this effort on your part was fueled by spam.
Well, it's an American product, isn't it?
Oh, yes. I mean, I thought I should
that's
put in a plug there.
In fact, spam got to be so sort of, well, it occurred everywhere, it popped up, but it got to be called a generic thing. You could ask for spam, and it wouldn't necessarily be hormel spam. It would be any
cream or treat.
That's right. That was all spam.
Yes. Well, tell me, how old were you when you got your PhD?
Oh, I was 32.
But of course, you would have got it at a much younger age
had
it not been for the war.
I took my master's in 38. The next year, while I was still lecturing there, Dr. Welsh and I produced tables of the non-central T distribution, but I did start on a PhD thesis on identifying clusters, which I never completed, and which the same work was done, but much better than I would have ever done it, by John Hartigan.
But much more recently.
Oh, much more recently, but I got onto something else. I did some systems of frequency curves.
Well, what was your thesis was about frequency curves?
That's right. Yes. Now, that was something I thought about during the war. When the war occurs, of course, you don't think of it as a blessing, but then I had a long while to think out what my thesis topic was going to be, and it was pretty well prepared, and Professor Pearson was my sort of official advisor, but I didn't need to have to worry.
Now, remind me again what year it was you finished that?
49.
When had Neyman gone to Berkeley?
Oh, he went before the war.
Oh, he went before
1938.
Ah, yes, you said that. Yes, right. I see. So,
of course, after the war, we came back, and Hartley joined us.
Did Neyman ever visit again?
I mean, yes, he came back. He came back just after the end of the war. He was back in London and brought us all some soap, which was in short supply at that time. Some ivory soap. It was the first time I'd seen ivory soap.
Really?
It sounds like
but not the first time you'd seen soap, I feel sure, having met your mother.
Well, we hadn't had much.
Incidentally, we have got well into your career now, but we have omitted one important story from your early childhood, which your mother did tell me about once. I feel it should be recorded.
Which one?
Is it not true, Dr. Johnson, that you once covered all the doorknobs in the house with jam tarts?
Yes, this was actually my grandmother's house.
Oh, your grandmother.
We were visiting them, and during the afternoon, they sort of were talking in the lounge, and I was just wandering around the house, and I saw these little open jam tarts.
At what age did this occur?
I don't know. I must have been about 8, I suppose.
Oh, 8?
Or 7,
An age
7.
of responsibility.
Well, and I'm not sure. It struck me that these little open jam tarts are just about the size of the doorknobs. And I tried one to see if it would stick on the knob, and it would. And it looked so nice, I went all over the house and stuck jam tarts on the doorknobs. And I don't think I got into trouble. They all thought it was so funny, but we didn't get any jam tarts to eat, which I thought was unfair. I didn't see why you couldn't still eat the jam tarts after they'd been on the doorknobs.
Well, I find that an interesting sidelight on your character. I haven't quite worked out what it tells us, but I will one day.
Well, ingenuity, I think.
Yes, I suppose. But come now, so you've got your PhD and you've got a teaching position at University College.
That's right. And
we're in the middle of austere England.
Well, during the same period, I was going to say that I taught some evening classes in 1944 to 46 at what used to be Regent Street Polytechnic, but now is Regent Street University.
Mm-hmm.
And at that, I was just after the war, the 45 to 46 year. There was the director of the actuarial tuition service decided to come to that because the actuaries had the idea that statistics were good for them, and his name was I've forgotten his name. I think it was Hayter. And I was taking a correspondence course with the actuaries, and he came to see me and said, "We've got a rather odd position. You're teaching me and I'm teaching you." Because he was teaching me on how to calculate exposed to risk. And I got to know him quite well, and when the actuaries decided they want to have a textbook on statistics, they asked me to be a joint author with Herbert Techley, who at that time was with the National Providence Institution. Later he became the government actuary. We wrote a textbook with two volumes.
2 volumes.
And you maybe see that later on if I brought it here with me.
So when did you do that, right?
This was in 1949 to 1950.
I see.
These volumes were seen by Professor Nicholson, who at that time was the chairman of the department here at University of North Carolina, and it was a result of this that I was invited to visit here for a year as a visitor in 1952 to 3. So it was partly due to my actuarial work that I got invited here, and I imagine it's how I eventually got here today, really.
That's interesting. So you were one of the early English statisticians to come and spend a year in the States. I mean, Bartlett came here at some point.
Bartlett had been here a bit before.
Oh, in the late 40s.
The 40s. He'd been a little while in Carolina. He was at Notre Dame too.
Oh, was he? I didn't know.
Which I'd never thought of as a centre of statistics.
Can you recall who was in the department here in Chapel Hill when you... I mean, obviously Nicholson was. I suppose Herb Robbins was there?
No. Well, let me explain. Herb Robbins was there, but I came because he was away on leave for a year.
Ah.
So I was sort of replacing him, though I'm not saying I'm the equivalent of Herbert Robbins.
No.
There was also Professor Bowes and Professor Roy, and I think Jack Hall. Was it Jack Hall?
Jack Hall would have been a student.
That's right. Hotelling was here. Yeah, he was the chairman
at that time. Oh, so Nicholson wrote to you even before he was chairman?
No, wait a minute now. Have I got it wrong?
It's possible that Nicholson became chairman in 51.
Nicholson had seen it. No, it was due to Nicholson and not Hotelling that I came.
But it's possible.
But Nicholson had spoken to Hotelling about it.
I see.
And the invitation came from Hotelling, but it was due to Nicholson having read the book.
I see.
That's what it was. Because I remember when I came here, I was sort of a bit puzzled as to why I'd been invited. And Nicholson told me it was because of this book.
I see.
Yes.
Well, now, sometimes when I look at names of people who were graduate students then, I mean, they all seem to have become quite famous in the profession. Can you remember many of the students from those days? Because you've mentioned Jack Hall.
Well, of course, I was only here for a year.
Yeah.
The only one I was directly concerned with was T.V. Narayana, who went to Alberta, and of course he's died since then.
Oh, dear.
He had quite a distinguished career. And there were others, but I wasn't directly concerned with them.
Well, I don't want to make a big thing.
She
I
can be,
just
maybe.
Seymour Geiser, was he around then?
No, I
maybe
think
he was
just,
later.
just before.
Miss Aliama George was here then. was
Aliama George was here, yes. But
So then,
she was a student. She took her PhD.
and then you went back to England.
And then I went back to England, yes.
To your lectureship, presumably.
Yes,
Is that
yes,
what it?
yes, yes. I got promoted to reader in '56.
When was your next trip? You came over to Case.
Oh, in 1960.
Yes.
Fred Leone at Case invited me to come for a year. That was also indirectly a result of being here because Professor Bowes had spent the previous year at Case, and Leone had said to him, "We got another visitor next year. Can you suggest someone?" And he suggested me. So it was due to Professor Bowes, and Professor Bowes wouldn't have suggested me if I hadn't been here in '52 to '53. So I spent a very happy year at Case, and I met the project director, Professor Chakravarti, while I was there, our present project director.
Didn't you also? I was trying to recall where you met the lady you later married.
That was just before.
That was just before.
But she came as well. We weren't married, but she came, and she was. We were in Case, and then we got married later on. This was Dr. Regina Elland, well, she was working at that time in Poznan in Poland, and we did get married, and we've written a book since then together.
You seem to write a book at the drop of a hat almost. But didn't you write a book with Leone? I mean, you did write a book.
Now, another consequence of this visit was that we wrote a couple of volumes on statistics and experimental design in engineering and the physical sciences.
Was
that was the last part of it was a title that he had. I didn't feel I was really much of an engineer or a physical scientist, but it was a nice book to write.
Did you write that book while you were there, or was this something you agreed at the end of the...
We started to write it, and then we continued, and finally I left this in '61. The book finally was published in '64. Various other things happened after
So
that.
once again you returned to University College.
Went back to University College, but while I was in Case, I was invited here to give a visit, colloquium talk.
Yes. I probably did that invitation. No, maybe not.
No, I was
doing it all. Anyway.
As a consequence of that, I was invited to come permanently, which I did in 1962.
Did you find it difficult to turn your back on England in 1962? Was there
Not
much
really
of
difficult, no. There were a lot of
I don't mean physically difficult, I mean
there were a lot of
psychological.
mechanical difficulties in arranging it all.
No, I didn't mean that, but you had no qualms.
No, I didn't feel any qualms. It didn't seem a bad lot here, really. There wasn't a bad lot in London either, come to that.
Yes.
And the weather was a lot better here.
Yes. Of course, you'd only been here you came in '62.
Oh, yes.
So you'd only been here a year when you moved into my house and kicked me out.
Well, that's not the same thing. You went away and you said, would you like to rent my house?
Yes. But you lived in my house for a year.
Right. That was very nice too.
Well, it was nice to have you as
Do you remember the Christmas time when I went back to England?
And the furnace jammed.
And the furnace jammed, and we came back and all the candles were drooping.
So here you are in Chapel Hill, settling in, you got married, and soon a cataclysmic event was going to take place. You were going to meet Sam Cotts.
Well, no. Well,
come on, let's be honest.
The very first permanent day I was here,
yes,
being September, I guess, I went to lunch, and at that time, Carolina Inn was closed at that time, like it is now. And then there was only the medical school cafeteria to go to. I went there and I met this other young man who was also going to the medical school cafeteria for the same reason. And he was very bubbling over, full of ideas, and talking a lot. And this was Professor Samuel Cotts. And I might say, as I said to you the other day, he still is bubbling with ideas and talks a lot. But this started a collaboration over the last 30-odd years now that has
Isn't that
produced
incredible?
many
30
books.
years?
Many books.
Have you a
yes.
total? How many books have you, jointly with him produced?
Well, I just run through them quickly. That might be the
That'd
best
be
thing
great.
to do. We started with 4 volumes on distributions in statistics. They published from 69 to 72. So it took us a long while to get everything going. Then, 77, I think, we had burn models, 1980.
And that was one book.
That was just one book, yes. Then, starting from 1980, we embarked on joint editorship of the Encyclopedia of Statistical Sciences, which is 9 volumes plus a supplement volume, published over 10 years. At the moment, they were producing an update of that with 2 more volumes. We then, just recently, got onto a couple of volumes on breakthroughs in statistics, which is 30 or 40 papers which we thought were path-breaking, with comments on eminent statisticians about their contents. We also published 2 small books on quality control, one on effects of inspection errors in quality control when you get the wrong answer in the inspection, and also on another one on process capability indices. We're at the moment also running through a second edition of the books on distribution, which the first one on discrete was all published last year. The first volume of the continuous univariate was published in September. The next one's going to be February or March next year, and we're working on the multivariate discrete. Don't know if it'll ever get finished, though.
Now at this moment, we'll come to it in a more formal way, but you are retired. How many books are you working on at this moment, this week, as it were?
Only, there's the proofs of the continuous univariate distribution 2, which is 700 pages, and in fact, this morning I completed my part of the proofreading and sent it off to one co-author. There's also this new book on multivariate discrete distributions, which we're doing with Professor Balakrishnan of McMaster University in Canada. And they're the only books we're actually concerned with.
I heard Henry Daniels once say about David Cox that he writes so many books, if he has to stop for a moment, he suffers from withdrawal symptoms.
No, I think in my case that would be a very happy situation if it ever happened.
I don't believe it. But so now I do recall there was a short-lived series of books from the department here, the first of which was a Russian statistical dictionary. Do you remember that? That was just Sam Cox.
That was just Sam Cox.
I
never
you
got
didn't have a
involved in
hand
that one. No, Sam Cox does some things without me.
Yes, well, let's hope
He has a
so.
book on multivariate analysis with Professor Fang.
Well, going back to Chapel Hill and so on, and you came here in '62, and well, there were ups and downs in the department, as we know, but then in 1971 you became chairman when Nicholson finally retired.
That's right.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about those years?
Well, it was an experience. I suppose I should have felt it was an honour, and it was also a job that had to be done. And there were a number of changes going on. One of the main things that was started, but which the major impact came while I was chairman, was the development of undergraduate courses, which had started a year before I was there, but they grew out of all recognition. And that occupied a lot of our attention. But my main aim while I was chairman was to try to provide a quiet atmosphere, which I thought would be very welcome at that stage of the department's history. And it was interesting to get a sort of overview of the whole of the department's activity, whereas if you're just doing your own work and you have some contact with other people, but this way you do go and get a bit of balanced view. I think it's a very good thing to do once in one's life, but I never felt any ambition to go on longer than statutory 5 years.
Yeah, I feel being chairman is a lesson in the ingratitude of man.
This is what your experience is.
Yes, I don't know whether this is... You feel you do an awful lot for these people and they never come and say thank you.
I agree with you, Wally, but I'd expected this, so it wasn't such a shock.
Okay, well, I suppose...
it is true that they just think you're someone there whose main purpose is to sort of be awkward, like we think about the dean.
Well, maybe. But in the middle of all this, and they were... I must tell whoever sees this tape that in this department, they were trying times. Leave it at that. Yeah. But in the middle of all this, you became editor of the journals of journal.
I became the theory and methods editor of the Journal of the American Statistical Association,
which was a great deal of work.
That was 72 to 75, and at that time I was very pleased. I had 3 offices. I had my academic office, and there was a separate office as chairman, which they don't seem to do now, and I had another office to be editor of the American Statistical Association. So I think this, in my own modest way, was a record for the department.
Yes, I'm sure it was.
Of course, I could have been perhaps an adjunct professor in biostatistics and had an office there too, but can't do everything.
And then I believe, I think a year after you ceased to be editor, you were on some committee to do with international... What am I trying to recall?
From 1978 to 1980, I was on the International Standards
International Standards
Organization. I was one of the American delegates to the Statistics Technical Committee.
So did this entail going off to places?
Yes, I went to 3 places. The first one was in Paris in 1978. The second one was in Philadelphia, 1979, and the third one was in London in 1980. And these were interesting, a bit tedious, because there was a lot of detailed argument about what sort of tables should be used and what standards you should use and so on. But this again was interesting from the international viewpoint. There were delegates there from the Western Europe and from the Soviet Union, from Hungary.
Now you said tables. What kind of tables were these discussions?
Inspection tables showing what sort of inspections you'd do if you've got more than a certain number of defectives. Did you go on to take a bigger sample?
Quality control
or
stuff.
if they were doing very well, did you take a lower sample? Quality control tables.
I didn't appreciate that.
And that was nice to see these places and look at them. And I do remember once that in the London meeting, we had to suspend one afternoon meeting because the Soviet representatives, they were then, wanted to see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace.
Really? So you have to stop all this scientific work? Oh, by golly. And then in 1982 comes what is technically called retirement, but that really seems just to mean you no longer teach Stat 11.
Stat 23.
Oh, Stat 23 was your
11 may have been yours.
Yeah, no, Stat 23 was my
that was, yes, I did, and I don't know whether you recall, I gave a wine and cheese party in the department to celebrate the fact that I just that morning taught my last Stat 23 class.
Yes, unless I missed that.
One of our colleagues, Professor Kelly, said perhaps there's a similar party in the dormitory celebrating the event from another point of view.
I'm sure there was much gnashing of teeth and tearing of hair and tears when the word spread that Dr. Johnson is no longer going to teach Stat 23.
But that would be nice to think, but I doubt it. Well, I retired at 65 because they changed the age limit to 70 on the next day after I
remember you telling me that. Yes.
I didn't try to stay in. I wanted to retire at 65, but if they changed it to 70, I felt I ought to stay on at least a token year.
Yes.
But I'm glad I did it, and I could say, well, I had to. See, I had to obey the rules.
But in truth, your retirement you've been just as busy since then.
Well, I haven't done any teaching. I've given a few odd lectures in odd places, but I've been very busy for the first 10 years with the encyclopedia and then these other books and the revisions of books. That's enough to keep one busy. And
Well, you've got to make plans, though, for the next 30 years of retirement, haven't you?
One can make plans, but they might not involve so much work. But I've enjoyed sort of meeting all the people, and I enjoyed.
Well, I mean, I must say, you're an enviable person for many, I think, to have a retirement that's so full of things to do. I mean,
oh yes,
many people retire and seem to find no way to fill their time.
No, I don't have any difficulty that way.
Obviously.
And the university has been kind and let me have an office, which I claim that I pay for by collecting the mail every morning, and also occasionally acting on committees for examinations and things like that.
Oh, you do that still, yes.
Yes.
But now, when all is said and done, let's talk a bit about your research areas now. What contributions would you feel you'd like to be most remembered for? Which are your...
Well,
you've done a great amount of publication.
Varied sort of things, but of course the PhD thesis was on what have become called Johnson curves, and I'm very fortunate that my PhD thesis is still referred to in books, which doesn't commonly happen 40 years after a thesis.
But you actually did re-edit the book on Elderton's curves.
Oh yes, we did that too. We missed
which
that
is
one
like
out.
a rival product, isn't it?
Well, Elderton wrote a book on frequency curves,
yes.
and Professor Pearson suggested I might take a hand in the revision, and we agreed with Elderton's son, who was in South Africa, that I should do it. And I discussed this with him, and we decided it would be quite reasonable to put in other things like Graham-Charlier curves, and even there's a chapter on I don't say Johnson curves, I say transformation curves or something like that.
But they are Johnson curves.
That's in the revised version of this. That was quite an interesting thing. That was way back in 1967.
Yes, but I remember you're doing that. But you know, that's one thing you'd like to. What other areas?
I did some work on analysis of variance, different types of power functions in the analysis of variance. Some work on sequential analysis, particularly sequential analysis and the analysis of variance, which is what I did while I was here in 52 to 53. They were published in Annals. Later on, earlier than that, Professor Florence David and I published several papers in the 1940s to 50s, including usually things about using order statistics and tests based on order statistics and things of that kind. Later, of course, I written a lot of papers with Professor Kotz, as well as writing these books with him, and he's quite a stimulating person to work with. And we wrote several books on measures of dependence, multivariate measures of dependence, multivariate classification of distributions according to hazard rates and things of this kind. I don't know that they've all had a lot of influence, but one does get people referring to them now and again. One doesn't expect too much. And I imagine that there were various useful things, like that they were useful at the time when Professor Egon Pearson suggested, and Professor Amos here in America, and a computer expert, Nixon. The four of us produced some tables of the Pearson distribution functions, giving their cumulative distributions as functions of beta 1 and beta 2, which were useful in their time, I think. Now, of course, when you have computers, you just press a knob and it does it for you, you hope.
More or less, more or less. Well, now, is there... this is, as we know, being preserved for posterity, and 50,000 years from now, a tape will be dug up by some archaeologists who will be watching this. Is there any stone I've left unturned in your life? Is there anything?
Well, there are probably a lot of things, but I don't know that a lot of things are especially relevant. I would like to say how much I've appreciated and been lucky in the colleagues and people who I met during my life here, and of course yourself.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
And Professor Kotz, Professor David. We was arguing with Professor Egon Pearson I owe Professor Egon Pearson my first appointment when I was only 21, and it was quite a relief to get it, of course. And of course my parents, if we go back to there, I suppose should mention Professor Chakravarti, who's our project director.
Well, I think you should certainly mention Professor Chakravarti, who is watching us closely anyway.
I think I've been very fortunate that most of the people I've met with seem to be friendly, and one gets on with them quite well. Among my PhD students, particularly the ones in London that I had, there have been one or two who've become distinguished, and I could mention the last year's president of the Royal Statistical Society, D.J. Bartholomew. I was his advisor for his PhD. There was Dr. Rita Morris, who was...
who I've met.
Yes, she was Director of Statistics at the Home Office before she retired. And there are a number of others who did, I think, quite reasonably well. I don't know that I can claim a lot of credit for it, but at least they were very good. There was William Jenkins, unfortunately, who died when he was young, but he was a joint author later on with G.A.P. Box.
Oh, when died? Oh, yes, he was very gravely ill, wasn't he?
That's right. He did a thesis on serial correlation.
And he was a student of yours?
I was his advisor.
I did not appreciate that. Well, I think we might, at least for now, regard this as
completely.
Enough for one afternoon, don't you feel?
I think so. I thank you very much for leading me through my life so well.
This is your life, Norman.
And for Professor Chakravarti, our project director, too. Thank you.
Thank you.